Welcome. My name is Charles Elder. I am the Media Relations Manager for the university, and this is the second in a series of in-conversation activities that we've organised as part of the university's connectivity campaign to show and reveal how connected we are with each other, with the outside world, with our research, with our community. And the conversations are here to reflect that connectivity and to try and communicate somehow. Maybe there'll be some unexpected connections that we discover between various people who work across the institution. This is, as I say, this is the second in our series, and we have a returning guest in Cheryl Metcalfe, who's a rehabilitative scientist, if I've got that correct. And we also have Richard Polfreman with us, who's a music technologist. And between them, they'll have a lot of common ground, perhaps, and maybe some uncommon ground we might discover. But without further ado, I'll introduce Cheryl Metcalfe.
As Charles said, I work in the interface between sort of rehabilitation and science. I'm based in Faculty of Health Sciences, and I study biomechanics predominantly, so using motion capture for various wonderful things to do with measuring whether rehabilitation works or doesn't work, measuring progressive illness and disease, and I particularly focus on hands. So hand function and movement is my passion. What I do various sort of development of different technologies, different ways of measuring things, but it all, at the end of the day, usually comes back to the hands and my geekish fascination. So, and we met a few years ago now, didn't we?
Yeah, in your lab.
In my lab for my sins, yeah.
So I'm interested in human-computer interaction for musical purposes, usually for creative purposes. When I first started dealing with computers, they were very much a keyboard was the way you interacted with a computer, and a screen, so not quite as far back as punch cards. And they were very unfriendly, very text-based, very sort of unfamiliar environments to musicians and creative people. And clearly we've moved a long way from that these days, with our children using touch screens, etc., from far too young ages. And are totally happy and understand these systems very, very well. But still, some of the ways of which we interact with computers for music are quite limited compared with how, for example, a musician interacts with a violin, which is a very, very sophisticated and nuanced process involving lots of feedback loops and in terms of touch and sensory motion and audio, etc. And so I'm quite interested in the kind of new tools, the new ways of which we can capture aspects of what we're doing as humans. So in particular, Cheryl's hands, how we can now capture hand data rather than just a mouse, which is quite a limited kind of input device with a few buttons, or even a MIDI keyboard, which is sort of okay for piano-like instruments, but doesn't really convey the sorts of controls that you would have from a violin bow or anything like that. So when I discovered that Cheryl had these incredible motion capture tools that can actually get all the details of all the joints in all the positions of the hand, I started thinking, aha, this is quite interesting. If I want to allow people to play electronic instruments that have a much more multi-dimensional control aspect than a sort of on-off button or maybe even a two-dimensional mouse, if we can then actually get all these sort of subtle connections between the fingers, etc., and given that most musicians are very adept at using their hands in complex ways, that this would be a suitable avenue to explore and to collaborate on, actually using these very detailed hand models in real time to control musical sound or effects even, or processes on sound. And I guess that's how we started a project which is called Hands on Sound, which is an AHRC funded project where we have a PhD student using these very expensive fancy tools that you have, but also some of these sort of cheaper off the shelf little gadgets which now can do basic hand tracking, not quite as reliably, but pretty well.
And that's where the technical challenge comes in, isn't it? Because over the last sort of 10-ish years, the laboratory-based techniques have come over leaps and bounds thanks to gaming and film and things, and particular interactions with CGI. So the technology is sort of improved massively over sort of my academic lifetime. But now there's these new things like markerless motion capture in games like Xbox Connect and the Leap camera systems, which use infrared technology to map depth images and capitalising on that kind of technology, which is, as you say, cheaper but more portable. Yeah. Which is a key factor with your guys, because putting our laboratory around a stage might be a little bit challenging.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is one of the problems with the project, in a sense, is because we're trying to evaluate these different systems, is that they do change so rapidly. So when I put the bid together, Dan started his project, the Leap Motion, which is this little USB device which can track your hands in real time, didn't exist, wasn't available. And of course, as soon as it came out, we thought, we must use this device because it kind of, hopefully, in an ideal world, will do what your expensive system would do, but at a fraction of the cost. So, and even while he's been working on it, the software has changed through about at least 2 generations and improved and changed what information it can give you about the hands. So it's an exciting place to be because it's moving on so fast, but it's also challenging in terms of trying to complete a project before the next generation has come and superseded what you've done, which is one of the exciting things about working with technology. I think I like it. It's not like there's a 16th century manuscript that's, it's not going to change. It's there. That's it. It was written a long time ago, and that's what you're dealing with. Whereas here, this device this week, another exciting device the next week, and keeping up with it is difficult.
So you talked about different ways of interacting and making music from like the mouse and different things like that, and we've talked about gestures in the past. Yeah. But how important is a physical instrument to a musician, or is there a new breed of musician that enjoys this kind of new phase of gesture-based music generation? Yeah,
that's an interesting question, and something I'm hoping to study. So one of my projects at the moment is I'm trying to compare different types of controller. So some of these touchless ones, so the ones where you're just waving your hands in the air, versus ones where you do have a concrete device to touch, to kind of judge how accurate they are, how satisfying they are in a sense to play. Because even if it's accurate and you can play in time or achieve a correct pitch, if it's not satisfying or it aches after a minute to do it, people aren't going to use it. It's not going to be fun. So part of what I'm doing at the moment is evaluating some of that. But clearly with a real instrument, there is that sense of touch and feel which you lose in something like motion capture. But there are some ways of getting around this. So one is to use haptic devices, which is one thing I'm quite interested in. So you can get joysticks or other movable devices that can resist your attempt to move them in a controllable way. So one of the tools I'm assessing is where you have a virtual model of a string on the computer and a joystick where you can push down on the string and actually feel the string push back, and then you feel it ping off when you pluck it. So this gives you a sense that you're actually plucking something rather than just waving a joystick up and down. And I know you're also interested in these sorts of haptic devices, more sophisticated perhaps than that one.
Well, to our mind, in the world of haptics, there's kind of 2 different strands. There's the kinesthetic haptics, which is the haptics that you're talking about with the joystick, which is, it gives you a movement, so it reacts on the joints basically, so you get sort of a sense of movement through your joints and interaction with your string. You get kind of a ping back and your finger presumably wafts around for a bit after you. But the other kind of haptics is tactile haptics, which I talked briefly about with Graham in the last conversation. And we've developed some devices which you just fit on your fingertips and provides different types of sensation just to your fingertips and to your palms. So at the moment we've got combinations of vibration, pressure and hot and cold. So by putting them in various combinations we can kind of recreate various different objects. So that's something that we're kind of grappling with and trying to come up with different ways of applying it at the moment.
How fast can that react? Because obviously one of the problems with a lot of sort of haptic things is they have to react fast enough, particularly for a musical instrument where you're playing potentially very fast notes. It has to be very, very reactive in terms of how quickly it responds, and you can feel that response. So, for example, I've tried sometimes to use the little vibrating rumble things, I think they call them in game controllers, these little vibrating things, on something like a Wiimote or an armband, and it really doesn't react fast enough. So you would make your gesture and then there'd be this sort of as the motor winds up, and then it's sort of as it goes down again, and that's sort of, that's too late.
Yeah.
So I mean, particularly heat, can it
heat's
give
an
you a very
interesting
quick
one. So actually, so we've worked with a brilliant technology partner and industry partner to develop these further, and they have done some electronic wizardry, frankly, to make sure that it is within sort of the neurophysiological requirements of when you interact with something to get it. But heat, hot and cold is an interesting one because you feel it and you can feel a change, but it's not until a couple of seconds after whether you go, oh, that's hot, or oh, that's cold. So it's your own kind of perception. So it's a very sort of fine, and I find this with myself because I've tested them a lot on myself.
I'd love to test it. It sounds
well, you can.
great. So you could feel the change quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, because that could be interesting. You could, for example, if you just needed to feel a difference between, say, being, let's say it was controlling pitch, you wanted to know where the notes were, like the actual in-tune notes, and you had a continuous pitch, you could feel a change perhaps immediately, like a fret on a fretboard of a guitar.
So would you just do that through, so, not musician,
Yeah.
right, but just wafting your hand around in space, using language that I can
Potentially
and
it could be.
Would you then feel bumps?
You like
or
feeling
something?
bumps, yeah, potentially. So, I mean, one of the most famous instruments is the theremin, a very early electronic instrument, which, as you may know, and there was an interactive, I think on the Google, when Google does these sort of animation things, they did a little fun web-based one recently to celebrate the theremin. And we can very easily build something like a theremin using these leap motion devices. But one of the difficulties about the theremin is where the note is. It makes it very, very hard to play. I mean, if you've watched somebody actually play it, they do these incredibly fine movements and you have to have a very good sense of pitch. But if you could put a haptic sensation in space, you could then feel where the notes were in space, and therefore you could use it to learn the theremin perhaps even. By the haptic device telling you where the pitches are, so you can train yourself to learn the movements without having a absolutely perfect sense of pitch, for example.
So as an educational tool, and then maybe transition on to the actual...
Yeah, and of course with the leap motion, the theremin just takes the nearest point on your hand to control pitch, whereas with something like a leap, we've got all of these other things. So we can make it very, very much more advanced than a theremin. We can make, very sophisticated, potentially, controls over sounds.
Okay. So so presumably there are people that don't have any musical experience for one reason or another, who then are able to play these instruments because they are not a piano and as complex as a piano or a violin or something like that as well?
Yeah,
Does it open up new areas for people?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, most years you may know that there's a university, we have a science and engineering day once a year on campus and at a weekend, and I don't know, thousands of people now come and visit this every year. And I usually take out some of these demos there for people to play with. And clearly a lot of kids and old people and grown-ups and all people, all shapes and sizes come along and try out these instruments, and they all seem to have a lot of fun playing with it. And there's not necessarily any massive musical ability required to interact with them. For example, and some great levelers. So we created one year where we used a face tracking piece of software that would allow you to play a virtual clarinet as an actual physical model of it. So the computer's simulating the acoustics of how a clarinet works, and you just had to sit there and open your mouth, and it would start blowing into a clarinet and playing notes, and you could just angle your head to change pitch. It's not the most easy to play instrument in this case, but potentially this could open up all kinds of, for people with, without limbs or without motion in their limbs, this could be a way of engaging with instruments that would just be impossible with just traditional acoustic instruments. So that's quite exciting.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were talking about moving the head, I was thinking like the kind of quadriplegic kind of people who only have the movement of the head, that opens up a whole new world of expression for them, presumably.
And also people who have lost, I don't know, most musical instruments require two hands, not all, but many do. And people who have lost or don't have ability in one hand, but still to recover the ability to play instruments, these virtual instruments, it's also an exciting possibility. So.
You see, that's fascinating to me, because a colleague and I in health sciences have been doing some work with children who have limb loss. So some of them have got congenital limb loss where they were born without a limb, and some have had meningitis and have lost limbs, situations like that. So we were working with children, and we had a PhD student who interviewed the children to get them to design their own limbs, basically. And we had such an array of different propositions for limbs, but we built them using rapid prototyping. And we had limbs that could only ride a bike, and limbs that could, hands that could literally just hold your iPhone. So it's very, very, the kind of practical considerations. But this kind of thing opens up a whole new area in terms of children who can't participate in music classes in traditional sort of ways. You can kind of bring them into the sort of music expression, I suppose.
Yeah, that's interesting. So were there any prosthetics you had to say, no, we can't make that, because we can't give you a hammer that's 6 foot hit your brother with, or
do you know
something.
What? There really wasn't, because there's always a reason why they came up with why they should have it. So there's examples in the region of prosthetic manufacturers building bespoke hands for kids who want to play sports and things like that. So things that can help you throw, and things that can help you ride bikes and things like that. There is always a reason why they should do it.
And we could design some special music ones, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I think our time is up.
Yeah.
So if anyone wants to ask a question, I think we have some time left.
You talked about, to a certain extent, of replicating the kinds of interactions that are possible with instruments. So I guess an obvious question is, are there entirely new forms of composition and performance that are going to be enabled or are already being enabled by these kinds of approaches?
Yes, certainly. Yes, I focused on kind of models of acoustic instruments, but certainly in the project we're collaborating on with Dan as our student, a lot of the things he's involved with are actually processing of sounds as opposed to generating sounds from scratch. So it might be placing a sound in a 3D space around an audience. So what gestures might be good for that, or delaying sounds, creating echoes, or filtering sounds. Often, so filters, for example, you can have complicated sets of parameters, like multiple sets of parameters that are quite difficult to control on a traditional mixing desk. Also, you'd be lots of twiddling, and very hard to twiddle more than 2 dials at once unless you're very dexterous. Whereas if we could map, all these parameters at once, so you could have bending different fingers would control you can imagine you could control a lot of filter parameters at once, and this would be processing sound, so changing the timbre of a sound rather than playing a piano note or something like that. Yeah.
Do you think you'll hit like a cognitive limit where the brain sort of goes, no, that's just too much, I can't deal with all of that input and output at the same time?
Yes, certainly. So one of Dan's early experiments, he was collaborating with a composer on a piece for organ and using one of these leap motion devices. So we thought organists would be good because they're used to sort of pulling lots of buttons and dials and whatever and playing stuff with their feet and their hands, so they're quite adept at controlling lots of things. And they can do a lot with one, they can play with their feet and one hand while they're waving around to process sound with their other hand. But certainly it was difficult for the organist to do more than a few basic things. But obviously there's only a small amount of rehearsal time typically for these things, and people, when they learn a musical instrument, they have 10 years of practice, whereas with these software things you've often got to, it's designed for a piece, the piece has 2 or 3 rehearsals and then it has to happen, so the cognitive load is challenging, but trying to make the gestures as intuitive, I guess, as possible will be one of the things that I think Dan's going to be working on, so that when you're doing stuff it makes sense in some way what you're doing to the sound, so that kind of reduces the load rather than having to think, oh well, I've got to adjust this angle precisely to get this sound. It will be a more kind of, oh, I kind of know what's going to happen just by exploring it.
Yeah. So you could include the haptic feedback, but you could also include visual feedback in some way to kind of augment the sort of the audio feedback you get from the change.
Augmented reality is something I'm quite interested in, which is this ability to layer onto what we see around us things that aren't there in 3D. So Ben, I noticed in the audience today, is interested in using some of this technology for conductors, to allow them to control electronic sources live. And if you had augmented reality, you can actually kind of see buttons in space that aren't there, and you can kind of grab them, or levers and things, and do gestures on these without having to sort of hope that your hand's in the right place, because you'll actually be able to see a virtual object in space, which is quite exciting.
Hello there. As a non-musician myself, I was really interested in what you were saying about the Science and Engineering Day and developing some digital instruments. Could those be made available more broadly to people who want to use those to, say, learn a new musical instrument?
Yes. I mean, the tools I'm using at the moment are just sort of custom-built research tools to do my own thing with. But there is a lot of commercial software out there now which does some of these things, but what's not always there is the way to take these motion tracking things in there to control them. But it's getting better. Than people are now publishing software packages which will take some of this basic information and turn it into MIDI, which is a sort of a language for controlling musical instruments, a very standard one, a very poor one, unfortunately. But there are some new exciting developments with MIDI, which actually makes MIDI becoming much more exciting in terms of what it can do, in terms of, again, giving lots of parameters to an instrument in real time, which is the difficulty with musical control. So I think at the moment it's a bit, you kind of have to find the little bits of software and join them up yourself, which is quite technical, but I think in the next few years it'll start becoming much more off the shelf. You just buy something you want to do, and GarageBand and these sorts of Apple tools will include this kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would you join me in thanking Richard and Cheryl? And again, the obvious question I didn't answer at the beginning was, why is Cheryl doing it again? Having Graham and Cheryl starting, where we're finding a chain and a thread to go through. So there doesn't have to be an obvious connection between people, but next time we hope Richard will be in the chair talking to someone, and we're planning that for some time in May, but we'll forewarn you and talk to you about the scheduling and that sort of thing. And we hope to see some of you there then. So thank you very much.